In this video, I'm going to give you a brief history of research methods that have been used in management, business, and generally the social sciences, so including like economics and things like that, and really go through and do a chronological ordering of research methods that have occurred, and so you can have a general insight of where the field is going and what you should be sort of working on in general. So if you don't know me, I'm an associate professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship. And I created this whole reciprocity project to give back as much as I possibly can. There were so many people that helped me out that I want to pay the favor for, to help you out as much as I possibly can. There is a lot of choices for research methods in management and business administration and the social sciences. And it seems like the choices are really endless. And if you are, whether you're a graduate student, maybe you're a PhD student, or an advanced undergraduate student, you're thinking about doing different research methods, you're probably really a little overwhelmed in what you should do and what you're thinking about. So, the first principle that I want to tell you about is just really keep it simple if you're doing any sort of research methods, and really look for simplicity. I know it's going to be tricky to do that, but that is going to be the best thing that you can possibly do. I stress that in so many of my videos, but I need to stress that even more. So what I'm going to do now is give you sort of a chronological ordering. This is kind of a series I'm doing right now about research methods that I think is important. I'm thinking about this at this moment. I'm actually teaching a graduate course, or sort of preparing to teach a PhD course in research methods. So I was thinking about this in terms of where I would think about research methods and where they've come from and what's going on in terms of general trends. And if you don't know, the social sciences in general, they follow general trends, right? So whatever is going on in economics, we tend to sort of follow that in strategy and management, a few years later, or sometimes we get some really cool insights and they follow us. Whatever's going on in sociology, we'll follow them. Sometimes they'll follow us based on different, it's really, you could sort of think of it as this kind of big amorphous blobby community that is doing different things at different times. And then if somebody has something that's cool, or there's something that is relevant, people will pick up on it and it'll spread throughout the field, right? It's kind of like this big diffusion process that happens across the field of social sciences in general, and even into the sciences, right? So we'll sometimes borrow from the sciences as well. And so I want to get into what's going on in terms of, common methods that have occurred over the last 40 to 50 years in terms of what was going on. So the 1970s and 80s, there was a lot of correlational analysis that was going on. So doing really simple correlations, and single case studies were pretty popular in terms of how people thought about, phenomenons around them, or, a small number of case studies if you're doing qualitative analysis, 1, 2, 3 kind of sort of things where they would use some situation and sort of talk about that single case. And it wouldn't necessarily be really deep and rigorous kind of information that you would be getting at, although that they were pretty foundational in terms of what they're doing. So the stuff that was going on in general, the stuff that was going on 10, 15 years ago in any field, it's going to be hard to get published with that in sort of today's, if you take the sort of currency perspective, or, where you look at how much, research was worth, research methods were worth 10, 15 years ago, and you try to apply it to today, there's going to be some sort of discount factor that happens where you have to do a lot more, and it's going to be a lot more rigorous. In general, in every field, it's happening that way. It's becoming a lot more focused on research methods, and there's pushbacks and stuff like that, but in general, that's the theme. We're getting better as scientists, right? So a lot of correlational analysis, really single case studies that was occurring in, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where, and the reason why is that computation. So, and a lot of this relates to computation, right? So computers, it was just hard to do these things otherwise. So a lot of that stuff had to be either done on, mainframe computers. And before that, it was just done by hand, and so you'd have to do all this stuff by hand. So really complex things weren't being done at that moment. And so the 1980s and 90s, there was this huge explosion of, not only doing, really sort of more rigorous research in terms of, surveys, for example, became a big thing because it became easier to sort of mail these surveys, getting methods in terms of understanding what they had to actually do surveys was getting, more solidified. And, case studies, more intense case studies that were taking, a really in-depth look at things was growing in complexity. You could see that sort of taking off in the 1980s and the 1990s. And the number of studies that were using more archival data analysis, and so this would be more doing the stuff that you do in economics and sociology, became a lot bigger in terms of what was going on. And there would be more data that was being used, more variables, more control variables that were being used. And to the point at this moment, if you're doing this kind of stuff, it's almost unlimited in terms of the number of control variables and data that you're going to be using, or that you can use with any of these archival data sets. And so that became a lot more dominant, I think, in a lot of fields, is where we're using a lot of sort of survey stuff, where you can get a wide range of responses. And we just knew how to do these a lot better. And as well as the sort of archival data analysis became really big. But then and this is more relevant, I would say, in sort of management and strategy and, those literatures in the 1990s and to the 2000s, there was this huge explosion in qualitative methods, and where people were taking it very seriously in terms of how to actually do these kind of things, and thinking about how to do qualitative analysis. And so a lot of these studies at that time, the ones that have the highest impact, are often qualitative studies, because they were not only really rigorous, and they were like drawing on multiple sources of data, doing multiple sort of techniques, using multiple cases where it's no longer like one or two cases, but you're looking at 10 to 20 sort of cases where people would sort of break down and look at different patterns, where they take different deep dives, whether it's within the case itself or between the different cases and stuff. There was all sorts of explosion in how to actually do these things, and so it became very popular. Not popular in the sense that there's a lot of articles, although it's growing a lot, but popular in the sense that it became more accepted. Qualitative research was, it wasn't nearly as accepted as a lot of us would have liked, because it was sort of discounted in terms of the knowledge that was being generated from it. But now I think it's readily accepted. And I think it's becoming more accepted in, the fields that are adjacent to us, in terms of where, what is relevant and what you can count. So in terms of, what's considered knowledge, I guess. And I think even the more quantitative fields, even though, real quantitative fields, even though that it's still not there in terms of being accepted. It's 2020 at this moment. They can still, it's not as considered frivolous, or it's not discounted as much, right? So there's been a huge explosion there. The other thing that's really exploded is, analytical methods that were, looking at archival data sets. Again, a lot of this had to do with, regression analysis, different kinds of regressions, all sorts of different kinds of regression, models looking at different distributions of what it actually looks like, whether you're using count data, whether you're using like a binary kind of data, whatever it is, there was an explosion about it, and an explosion of how to actually look at the different relationships, where they're using moderators or mediators, or looking at different ways of analyzing the data. It really took off at that moment in the 1990s to the 2000s. I started my PhD in 2005. And so I was, readily introduced to a lot of this stuff. And then the other thing that was really important at that time was, and there's lots of discussion about this, was hierarchical modeling of different sorts, right? So thinking about the world in terms of more complexity, right? So structural equation modeling and using LISREL was really a big thing and became a big popular thing to do, was using this sort of multi-level modeling. It's still popular, and it's still, I think especially in more micro fields, organizational behavior, psychology, that kind of stuff is still very popular. But it's not as gigantic, I guess, in terms of the popularity as it was at that moment in terms of where people were looking at this kind of stuff. And so was things like meta-analysis and systematic reviews. That became a really big thing in terms of thinking about can we synthesize this data and put it all together to make sense of what's going on with all these different studies, right? So a meta-analysis or a strategic review or systematic review is where you look at all of the studies on a particular topic and you sort of group it together and make sense of it and see if there's any sort of findings that you can generalize from that and that other studies have found. So those by definition, I think, have to be pretty quantitative meta-analysis, or else you're going to have to do a literature review that's going to be more expansive. I think that is a little bit there's probably somebody that's going to correct me on this, because I just haven't seen a lot of people treat qualitative studies in meta-analysis and in that kind of area well. I think that there's room for growth in terms of understanding how to actually do this kind of stuff. So I just haven't read everything that's out there, so I'm sure that there's a study that's out there that's done that. And then in the last 10 years, starting about, I don't know how to pronounce this last name, but he's a Stanford researcher in medicine, Idonis, and I think it's Greek, it is his last name, and he sort of pointed out that a lot of studies in medicine are maybe that there's not a lot of rigor behind them, and I think it came out in 2008 was the time period when the study came out, and then there was the explosion in psychology about he said Brian Nozick, started pointing out that a lot of studies you can't reproduce a lot of studies, and that was about 2010, and then all of a sudden there was this whole credibility revolution that started, and there was a huge growth of causal identification, which was going on already. Lots of people were looking at causal identification, right? So Cook and Campbell was mostly, that was kind of in education. Some economists were looking at that in terms of understanding causal identification, but it didn't become a big thing until in a lot of fields, it didn't become a big thing until about 2015 or so, where people were taking it seriously, because they were like, holy cow, we aren't treating causal identification, so identifying what the mechanism is, we weren't treating that as seriously as we should have. And so there's been a massive growth in things like experiments, field experiments, anything that's natural experiments, sort of quasi-experimental stuff, where anything that you're trying to get at the understanding what the mechanism is a little more, that has grown in a lot. Other kind of methods, regression, discontinuity sort of methods, there's lots of stuff. I'm not going to get into all of the sort of nuances there, but it's trying to really focus on what we're actually looking at a little more, right? So what is the mechanism that we're trying to capture? And so what that is doing largely is that it is, making the theory really tight, a lot more tighter than what we used to do. And then at the same time, it is putting a lot more emphasis on the methods. Now, a lot of people might, with some of this stuff, it's tricky because it's hard and expensive to do some of this stuff unless you're using archival data. So, we might not be better off by using some of these more causal identification techniques than what we were before, although I personally believe we are. But at the same time, we're becoming more nuanced with the context. And so to get better causal identification on these things, we might have to use it in multiple contexts and get a sort of a wide array of what's going on. So that's why I might suggest that it's coming at a cost of generalizability, right? So even though we're understanding what's going on a little bit better, it might come at a cost of generalizability in terms of what we used to do with correlational analysis, where we just took some data across a wide range of things and, some cross-sectional data and took correlational analysis of what's going on and looked at what that correlational analysis was doing. So I think what's happening too is that with all of these complex techniques and archival data analysis, with using these sophisticated regressions, and it's almost becoming full circle at this moment where we're coming back and we're really thinking about, hold on now, do we need all of these things? And I think there's a lot of messages that are going on at this moment is, why don't we try to make things simple? Why don't we come back to where we were and really think about what we were doing before, and really do a better job of what we were doing before, and really focus on simplicity rather than going into these more sophisticated areas. I think that's where we're going at this moment, right? So moving away from sophisticated, empirical modeling and really focusing on fundamentals a lot more. And I think that's where the world is going to go with this, because we know the world is a lot more complicated than what we had assumed. And it's always like that, right? Every single year we're like, oh man, the world's really complicated. And we come back to that concept and that idea, and we have to become a lot more simpler, a lot better as scientists, much more careful, really taking steps of making sure that we're doing everything right, and really being precise as much as we can. So added on that, there is, people that there's a push towards registering your, experiments and your studies and all that kind of stuff. There is just a lot more complexity that's going on. And on top of that, there is a lot more ethical concerns. We're aware of a lot more with ethical concerns. So stuff that we were able to do in the 60s, we're just not able to do that stuff anymore, because that was, would be considered unethical. So we're really becoming just better scientists, with a lot of this stuff a lot more clear with what we're trying to do. And so that leaves a lot of room for you to do all sorts of stuff with any of these methods, but just doing it a lot more rigorous and taking a next step further and making it just much better in terms of telling your theoretical stories going forward. So with that, hopefully you learned a little bit and where the world is going with research methods. I don't know what the next hot thing is going to be, but I do know it is going to be, more rigorous, and it's going to help us understand the world a little bit better. And it's probably going to be, it's going to increase in sort of simplicity at the same time of trying to understand what the world is all about. So with that, give me a thumbs up. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. Take care and have a wonderful day. Bye.